Good afternoon, everyone. It's my real pleasure to be here to give this webinar. And as always here at UTS, we start with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands UTS stands, and to pay respects to their elders past and present, and for them as custodians of knowledge for this place, and to acknowledge all the country upon which the people attending today's webinar are placed. Yeah, so I'll hopefully talk for about 30 minutes, perhaps even less. If I'm talking really too quickly, just send in a question and say, slow down, Nick, and that'll pop up on my screen. I talk quickly when I'm excited, and I'm quite excited today. The things I'm going to run through are just sort of what I mean by impactful partnership, and then kind of three key findings from the study I've been involved with relating to kind of the essential ingredients of impactful partnership with families, particularly with parents. Ways in which expertise can be productively and strongly expressed without parents feeling bossed around, and this idea of working at the frontier, which I think is a really exciting thing. And I've chosen those three aspects of the study because they go right from the sort of shop floor in terms of sort of everyday interactions that you might have with families, through to more kind of practice-wide or even institution-wide or service-wide issues. So if you're a kind of daily practitioner working with parents, I hope there's something relevant, but also if you're there having a supervisor or a managing role, I hope there's something that will be useful to you as well. So just a little bit first about the study that I'm talking based on the talk for today. It was called Creating Better Futures and funded by the Australian Research Council. And I believe what we could produce, me and my colleague Tina Clerk, who was a research associate with me on the project, we have a very rich and I think quite extensive evidence base, and it's quite an unusual data set for this kind of sector and this kind of work. We looked at a range of services, so they included home visiting, particularly sustained home visiting for what in New South Wales we sort of kind of call a level 2 risk, so kind of beyond a universal service where there are some risks identified in a family, but not at that very top pointy end for those services. We looked at day stay services where parents go and stay for a day, usually 3 times with a number of weeks interspersed. PCIT stands for Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, so very much based on parents playing with toddlers. CFCs refers to the Child and Family Centres in Tasmania. We did research in 3 of those. Supported play groups included multicultural play groups and play groups specifically with parents of children with disabilities. And we also looked at parenting groups of various formations, particularly in New South Wales, that was. The data, why could I claim it to be rich and extensive? Well, we interviewed over 130 people. We did 130 interviews, and they were typically with parents at the start of their engagement with the service, part of the way through it and at the end. And then when parents were able to do so, we continued with them 6 months, 9 months, and up to 12 months after they'd finished their contact with a particular service. We also did a lot of observing practice, particularly in the first phase of the study. So we wanted to really kind of get a sense of what goes on in these practices. And it was important to us that if we interviewed people, they would tell us what was important, but there might be important things that weren't kind of at the forefront of their explicit awareness. And that's where the observation was really important and helpful, because we were able to spot things in the observation that actually didn't come up in the interviews, but turned out to be really crucial. Overall, there are just about 100 parents participating, representing about 90 families, sometimes a mother and the father or more than one carer is involved. 61 different professionals with different qualifications: nursing, social work, early childhood education, child and adolescent mental health, across a wide range of what we kind of in this space. And 13 volunteers who were members of the public, often parents who had this kind of experience in their past, who then kind of re-engaging with services. That picture at the bottom, Creating Better Futures, is taken from the homepage of the website that we've created, which has detail and different kind of resources and things like that, including more different themes and ideas than I'll have time to talk about with today. That's creatingbetterfutures.org. So firstly, I put partnership in this title, and maybe that some of you are kind of already very committed to the idea of partnership and very aware of it as an agenda in services for young people or families. and for others it might be strange. But I think regardless, it's important for us to be clear about why we set things up as interesting and worthy of our attention. And the thing is, when we're working with parents around parenting and early childhood, kind of infancy up to toddlers or beyond, it's very easy as an outsider in the family to be an unwelcome intrusion. None of the services I looked at were forced on families, but nonetheless, there's a stepping into privacy and a kind of a vulnerability there, which makes these things difficult potentially for parents to experience. And study after study shows us, and it's very intuitive, that when people come in from outside of family and offer assistance or help, or families seek support with a particular problem, it's very easy to feel judged very quickly, even if judgment was not the intention on the part of the professional. And there is less strong but still convincing, I think, evidence that good advice, very, very evidence-based, relevant to a family, likely to succeed, can be resisted. I've seen that happen in the observations that we did in this study and through the interviews. And even if it's accepted, it can leave parents feeling that, yes, in fact, they were incapable to start off with, and what they had needed all along was some kind of superhero expert to come and rescue the situation, which is disempowering. So I'm suggesting that there are reasons of ethics why we should work in partnership, reasons of evidence, and reasons of impact. That if we're going to have the best impact, partnership is a useful way forward. But why is impactful partnership difficult? It sounds like a lovely idea. It's one of those things that perhaps very few people, nobody's going to say we should have less partnership or work in, kind of rivalry or conflict. But the thing is, whilst it's an easy idea to accept and perhaps a very seductive one, impactful partnership is really difficult to pull off. And a lot of the work I've done over more than a decade has actually been to show the craft and the accomplishment in often what looks like perhaps ordinary or routine work. And I'm very aware that many people, particularly child and family health nurses, but also early childhood educators, often feel relatively low in the hierarchies in terms of their own professional fields. I've spoken with professionals who say, my colleagues or my medics just think I sit and cuddle babies all day or change nappies and things like that. And it's really important to me to be part of an evidence base that shows that the work that people in these settings do is in fact really hard. And one of the ways it's hard is in impactful partnership. And the way I summarize this is what I call a dilemma of expertise. And we have, if you imagine a kind of a pendulum swinging between two extremes, and these are extremes, so I'm not trying to characterize routine practices in any particular settings that I'm aware of. But at one extreme, we have the expert model, where the professional or the practitioner dominates knowledge. I know what child development looks like, I know what attachment looks like, I know what might be useful here. And they not only dominate kind of the knowledge agenda, but they also set the agenda. It's up to me to determine what is a problem and what is the priority here. And the expert model involves somebody coming in and fixing problems for others. And you can see traces of that in the way we engage with professionals from many backgrounds. You might hire a migration lawyer to help you get your visa sorted, and you want that person to know what they need to know and tell you what you need to be done and kind of fix it. But across the professions, there's been a move away from that as a working assumption for how practice should unfold. And at the other side, if this pendulum swings the other way, we get a kind of overly relational focus, which Catherine Fowler, a colleague of mine here who works in the health faculty at UTS, has described as sort of the being nice model. And what that involves in terms of the professional is kind of a retreat from knowledge and expertise, out of fear of being too sort of bossy or knowing it all. You get sort of stuck. And what can happen is that rather than kind of imposing an agenda on others, for fear of doing that, there is no agenda at all. And the whole intervention process or the support process, helping process, loses its momentum. And so you can, this has been described in Sweden as a kind of a difference between an expert and a friend visiting. But what you find is that these visits can be very supportive and nice and warm and nurturing and things like that. But actually no change happens. And really that's what parents are looking for in some way. The reason why they're engaging with these services often is because they want some kind of change. So there's your dilemma. How do you wield your expertise without kind of bossing and setting the agenda and knowing it all, but also how do you stay confident about your expertise given that we know these problems, and how do you go beyond being nice? So partnership has been described by many people, including Crispin Day and the people at the Centre for Parent and Child Support. And I'm not suggesting that their notion of partnership doesn't include impact. If you read carefully, and I really do think they have their eye on impact. But there is a sense in which you can be doing partnership, but there might not be a kind of impact might not be as strong as it could be. So that's why I kind of constantly coupling these words, partnership and impact, and talking about impactful partnership. And I think there are kind of three things going here: expansion, mutuality, and perhaps invisibility. The expansion issue here, so this kind of, when I'm talking about partnership, and this reflects my kind of working with Vygotsky as a kind of an inspiration for how I understand learning, both of adults and of children. An expansive notion of partnership is not one like a market trade, where a professional might have some knowledge to sell, and in exchange for that they want to get some knowledge from a parent about what was going on for their family or other things like that. That's a transfer model, and the point is that yes, knowledge might be exchanged, but the sum total of knowledge at the beginning and the end is the same. A mind expanding notion of partnership is rather different, and it says that the partnership takes both parties into unknown terrain, and kind of new knowledge that was never there before comes into being. So it's kind of like a horizontal notion of learning, and Ia Engerstrom's talked about this, where kind of collaboration is productive of new knowledge, not just the exchange of existing knowledge. So that's what I mean by expansion. There is mutuality here, and particularly I'm thinking of intimate outsidership, so that as professionals and practitioners working with families in early childhood or child and family health settings, we often come to know things about families that maybe nobody else knows, and we tread very closely into that private sphere of family life. And that intimacy is really important in understanding the context and being able to support and facilitate change. But at the end of the day, as a home visitor, as an early childhood educator, as an adult, mental health worker, whoever it is, a social worker, we're not staying overnight with the family. We're not part of that family. We have to walk away. And so whilst we're kind of intimate in our relationship with the families, we also have to maintain our outsiderness. And it's that outsiderness that's crucial to the asymmetry in the relationship, and is really important to embrace. And then finally, I talk about visibility and invisibility. And that's when I first started, and I spent a year on a residential unit on a different project. What I noticed was that what was being counted and measured as outcomes of this service was a really poor reflection of what was going on, and that there were hugely significant outcomes that I saw happening for families that were not being measured by families' happy sheets. To what extent do you think you met your goals this week, or measures of parenting confidence, or other things like that. And I think actually if we can make visible and articulate strongly the outcomes we're delivering, that's a good thing. But there's an issue here, which is that particularly in more complex environments like a child and family centre, where you have lots of sectors working together, it's not like you can sort of pull out a piece of string and say this input led to this outcome. Often it's much more like a whole bunch of ingredients that get mixed together to make a soup, and by the end you can't say exactly which bit gives you the overall flavour. So now here's something that was mentioned by Dale there in the introduction. A big occupation of mine is small things with big effects. And this came from an early interaction I had with a service manager who said, Nick, we do not need some smart ass from UTS to tell us we need more time and money. And I was like, oh, fair enough. And then the consequence of that was, neither do we need some researcher to come and tell me I need to reorganize my whole workplace structure and massive changes. Not helpful. So what it challenged me to do was to look at, okay, so what are the small things that are already possible in the existing conditions that actually might have really, really big effects? And when I mean big, I mean significant for families and their outcomes. That's what I mean by big. And so it really is the little things that I've been interested in over the last 10 years. Little things that are already existing, already possible in the conditions that we work in, but perhaps might be invisible in their outcomes they're making, might be unacknowledged, overlooked, or perhaps if we become aware of them, we can take control over them and get even bigger impacts out of those things. So if we wanted to describe, trajectories of change, positive and lasting change for families, what I realized were the big actions and interventions were not a full account of what was going on. And the impacts relied on multiple, entangled, small actions. And this arrow here has kind of got a little DNA spiral, and it's kind of showing that, you know, small things going together in some complex relationship kind of what produces a big thing, the big impact. So here we go. Here's the start of the findings. And across the whole data set, wherever we saw impactful partnership, we saw three things. And where the partnerships that we were kind of talking about were not so well, at least one of these things was missing. So it's why I'm sort of fairly strong in suggesting that I think these are essential ingredients. By what I mean is, without them, you don't get impactful partnership. But also, I think they're the essence of impactful partnership. They're what it's made of. So they call them 3 deal breakers. And the first is H, help, for helping. And this is helping families in practical ways. It could be strategic ways, like some sleep and settling strategies, or an approach to shifting from breast milk onto solid foods, or to managing toddler tantrums or aggressive behaviour. It's help on emotional aspects for parents, including their own emotional labour perhaps, or their sense of themselves as failing or successful as parents. And relational help, in terms of how parents relate to one another, relate to the wider community, see themselves through the community's eyes, and of course relate to their children. And then we have C for challenge. And this is an important part of the family partnership model, increasingly acknowledged in the new materials coming out of the Centre for Parent and Child Support there. And the point is to pitch challenge right. Without challenge, there is no change. Change, I think, is something that's inherently challenging. But we have to be able to pitch challenge so that we're offering challenge that's reasonable to parents, may well take them out of their comfort zone, but not overwhelming. And then, Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development as a nice way of kind of thinking about that pitch. And then we have P for possibility. And this is something that's a little bit more diffuse, but the more we looked at it in the data, the stronger it came through once we know to look for it. And it was really acknowledging that for some parents, possibilities can seem impossible or too dangerous to contemplate because of how unlikely they seem. Only a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to parents who currently have a child fed through a nasogastric tube. And some of them were saying, I can't let myself imagine a future where my child feeds normally, by which they mean orally. It just seems too risky for me to set my heart on that. And so the possibility wasn't entertained. And there were all sorts of things that for parents, possibility seemed unreachable. If it seems unreachable, why would you invest energy and risk perhaps in trying strategies to do that? Just as a teenager who thinks they're useless at maths, it might make sense for them not to visibly try hard at maths because they know however hard they're going to try, they're going to fail. So impactful partnership has to have this sense of possibility that parents can subscribe to, that parents can see themselves in, a sense of future that they can imagine as being achievable for them. And that all has to happen in what we call a relationally safe space for learning. Relationally safe, we mean that the learning journey is not in itself going to be a threat to the relationship between the practitioner and the parent or families that you're working with. And for learning, what I'm talking about is parents and practitioners learning together, and that's that expansion, that journey into the unknown, not just exchanging knowledge, but learning together. I've noticed a little question come from Professor Stratford. I'm going to try and look at that at some point if I have a little pause, but if not, at the end there. So one of the questions, if we think back to that dilemma of expertise, right, where we had the pendulum swinging from one side to the other, I thought it might be useful today to offer one way in which we saw expertise really being put to effective work by practitioners in their interactions with families. So these were strong articulations of expertise. Now, what I mean by strong is grounded in core, stable knowledge around parent-child attachment, developmental milestones, perinatal mood disorders, whatever it might be. And strong in the sense of making a difference. And this also turns into these small things that have big effects. And what it was particularly from the observations, we saw that sometimes professionals were making a big deal out of things that I didn't realize were important, and neither did the parents often. And then we started looking more into this, And over again, and like close to 2,000 times at least that we observed this. And our observations, there's 70 observations across different services. So this is not just happening in, obscure places. This is every single site we went, we saw this happening. Was this 3 steps? Firstly, the practitioner noticed something. They drew attention to an aspect of parenting or childhood or parent-child interaction that might have been overlooked, or parents might have been aware of it but not realised that it was any kind of big deal. The next step is to explain its significance to something that matters to the parents. That's really important. And the third step is to what we call attributing agency, which is to say, whatever this thing that we've noticed is that we now understand as important, we've got to locate that in the domain of parents' accomplishments or sphere of action. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them often we saw when parents were arriving at a service, if it was one located in a particular clinic or something like that, just to say, I noticed how your daughter held your hand when you came across the car park. There's your noticing. Showing immediately that you're paying attention to them and you kind of care. The significance. Isn't it wonderful to know that she's safe with you when there are cars around and she might run off? There you go. I'm showing you I care about your child's well-being. Of course you do too. And then attributing agency. What an amazing job you have done as a mother to get her to hold your hand when you need to and know that, know she needs to do that when there are cars around. So in that case, it's something that's already a strength there. It could be seen as very mundane, but you're saying it's something that's not happened by accident. You're actually there saying, part of my job is to look at what you're already really good at. And whilst that might seem small, the point is, if that's the parent's first experience and they're walking in having already judged themselves as a failure because they've got to turn up to some intervention service or whatever it might be, and their very first experience with you is one that's affirming and positive and respectful and looking for something cool, it's just the same as what we might call specific label praise for toddlers. But there are also different kinds of noticing and different examples, which I'll talk through in a second. So we have to think about, well, how do we expand the possibilities for this sequence through noticing? And noticing is hugely charged with professional expertise. What to notice, how to notice it, stems from lots of formal knowledge and also experience. You might notice something slightly different about a child today than you did last week. Might be a parent's demeanor or presentation has shifted. It might be this parent is something similar to another family you've seen in the past. All sorts of, or it might be something you notice about a child's gaze or a latching if it's breastfeeding or some sound that's made. All sorts of things like that. Formal knowledge, lived experience. That's where it starts from, expertise. And it comes out through 2 channels. The first one is what we call the sensory channel, which is stuff happening right now in front of you. Live events, so it might be a parent talking to you or a family member, it might be family members interacting with a child, it might be the child by themselves during the day in a daycare centre or a playgroup, whatever it might be. Stuff that's happening and you might be there to see it, to hear it, smell it if it's the case of nappies or something like that, or even touch it if you're feeling in a child, kind of you're holding them. So very much a sensory-based noticing. There is also this reported channel, and we realized this was, as practitioners, we're not there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with families, but lots of really important stuff relevant to the work we're doing with families happens between when we meet them. Of course it does. That's no-brainer, really. So the reported channel is about expanding what could potentially be noticed by soliciting rich accounts from parents of what's been going on. And what do I mean by rich account? Well, full of concrete detail, so that that's stuff that if it was happening in front of your eyes, you might be looking for or listening out for. Instead, you have to get verbalized by parents or other carers or other people around a child in order to pick up on what they're saying and go, aha, I think that's really important. So that could be, for an example, a parent saying, oh, over the last 2 days, she started to, putting paint in her mouth when we're playing, we're doing messy play. And that could be presented by the parent as, oh, that's, is it dangerous or something like that? But you might be saying, okay, tell me more about the paint in the mouth. Tell me what was happening. So you've noticed it and you want a little bit more concrete detail. And then you might say, oh, that's really important for the work we're doing on her transitioning to solid foods, because it's showing that she's, exploring things with her mouth. That's where lots of nerves are. Then how do we wrap it up? We've got to attribute agency to the parents, and we might say, so the opportunities you're providing her for that messy play and letting her get a bit of paint in her mouth is actually helping her with her shift to solid foods, so keep going. So that's how it might work through a reported channel. Now, we found that noticing happened in three kind of aspects of work with families. One is to build on current strengths. So that would be like with a hand-holding thing I told you earlier, or it might be, for example, if your parents come in, I've heard this said many times, I don't think my child loves me very much, and the parent goes out to the room to get you a glass of water or something like that, and you notice that the child's gaze follows them, or that they smile when they come back, or they recognize their parent's voice. You might say, I noticed when you called through the kitchen that your child was kind of, following where you were, and when you came back in the room, they kind of physically relaxed. That's telling me that you're the most important to them, and that's what we would look for as a sign of their love for you. And then you've got to wrap it up, attribute agency. So all the things you've been doing to talk to her when you're out of the room, and providing her with the food and the care, and being there when she cries, all those things are helping her realize that you are this most important person to her. We've got noticing in the context of enhancing guided change, which might be as part of kind of ongoing work, for example, relating to transition to solids, where you might have suggested trying messy play. And we also have it in challenging unhelpful constructs. And that example I gave before, for example, about a parent who says my child doesn't love me, we might want to challenge that construct there and look for evidence that the child in fact does love the parent. So then finally, so that's noticing. I wanted also to talk about working at the frontier. And I'm going to present, and this is kind of all about work and journeys into the unknown, perhaps an uncomfortable truth. And I acknowledge here I'm being, kind of, just as I was with the expert and the relational and nice models, presenting rather sort of straw scarecrows here at extremes, but to make a point about something really kind of important that we found empirically. I'm going to say impact will be limited if partnership practice is routine, if it's familiar, risk-averse, rigid, blind to difference, and 100% evidence-based. Now, last is a particular challenge to the certain climate. And I'm going to say impact is enhanced if partnership practice is, rather than being entirely routine, has innovative components. And I'm not suggesting innovation for the sake of it. One of my key principles as a researcher, always when addressing people I've done research with, is leave as much intact as possible. And that's why I start by saying what's already working really well. It's not about major upheaval, but there's a difference when kind of routine becomes a block or a wall to innovation. That's when we worry. Now, familiar practice, of course, there may be many things that you do hundreds and hundreds of times a year, giving a domestic violence screening or an Edinburgh Depression scale, or various kind of very common parts of practice. Familiarity is really important, and that the professional experience and knowledge that comes out of experience is important. But I'm going to say out there that when we look to the really good examples of impactful partnership, there was always some novelty or strangeness for the professional, for the practitioner involved, always something a bit kind of beyond the familiar. The risk aversion is an interesting one. Of course, we don't play fast and loose with parents, with family members, with children and their trajectories. But we have seen some professionals who felt unable to take risks. And what might those risks be? Well, it might be asking a parent to do something and you can't promise it's going to work. That could be risky. What if you have to ask that uncomfortable question, the elephant in the room, about potentially domestic violence or a dangerous practice that a parent might be having? I've seen a family, where the child was laid down on the floor under a massive pile of books with some, a hammer and a mallet on the top of it. It could easily have fallen over. And the risk there might be, what if I insult the parent and they don't let me come back? But we have to accept some risk. Impactful partnership is always going to involve something unknown. Some consequences or outcomes that we can't 100% guarantee. Completely rigid practice is going to be a wall to impactful partnership. Some agility in our practice is going to be important. And I mean agile just as we imagine agile within a human body. You know, we're not expecting everybody to be able to put their leg behind their head, but we do need some kind of flexibility to bend and kind of adapt and adjust, approach, distance, all those kind of things. What I mean by impactful partnership being embracing of differences, that's where we fine tune to this particular family and what goes on and what might be important to them. And the challenge to evidence base is, I'm not suggesting we should ignore the evidence, far from it. I'm, you know, a person who is a researcher, spends my life trying to generate good evidence. But I remain convinced that there are some elements of practice which evidence will never tell us what to do. Evidence is never going to sew up the question of what should I do next with this family. There'll always be some discretion, judgment, perhaps instinct or gut. And sometimes what the evidence says about families in general might not be the best guide to what this family needs on a human basis. So, but guided by human need is really important. I'm just going to talk about 4 examples of frontier work, and then I promise I'll shut up fairly soon. The slides are coming to an end. So we've got this idea of a spiral. You can see that little triangle in the middle. That's that relationally safe space for learning with help, challenge, and possibility. And the idea is that each of these frontiers might kind of expand the partnership into new possibilities. So firstly, we encounter difference. No 2 families are the same, of course they're not. And so part of our job, the learning as professionals that we have to undertake, is to understand what's important to this family, what matters to them. And a goal may not be the same as what matters to them. A goal could be my child sleeps through the night. What matters might be that I feel rested enough that I can play and give warm attention to my daughter in the daytimes. A goal might be, reduce, feeding, or a nutritional intake. But what matters might be not feeling rejected if you spent a long time preparing food and the child is pushing it away. So we have to encounter difference. We have to go looking for it so we can attune our practice to it. Secondly, innovating and improvising. This is about kind of trying new ways, might be trying something new completely. And I've seen that happen in lots of services where there's some families, the service was struggling to engage the families, so they did toy swap bags or pop-up play group on the street or lots of different things. It could be trying completely new, kind of objects to help in a cot, independent sleep associations, all sorts of things. With one family, there was a mother we visited who was completely stuck in her house because she's very fearful of an accident happening. And so in one home visit, we ended up trying walking across the road with a doll in the pram. That person, the practitioner, had never done that before, right? Trying new things. But there might also be new ways to do something very familiar. New ways to think about messy play, new ways to think about making feeding fun. And that innovation and improvisation might happen at a service level, or it might happen in a moment with families. And then another frontier is about creating and responding to opportunities. And this is creating opportunities is really important, just like the reported channel in noticing creates opportunities to find out and notice things that have happened since you last saw a family. So we can create opportunities in the moment or in the ways we practice. What I put e.g. RU walk. So when I was on the residential unit, a number of the staff there did this thing where they walked really slowly past the rooms where families were staying, not particularly going anywhere, with their hands behind their back. You imagine how a nurse normally walks around a hospital is, I've got something to do, I'm too busy, and you have to kind of disturb them. That was a way of walking which invited people to ask them for help, ask them a question. Similarly, silence in conversations can create opportunities for parents to ask questions or to divulge more information. So there's that, really thinking about how can I create opportunities for us to do something cool or for me to find out something cool. And then there's being ready to seize the moment. An opportunity comes up, okay, now this toddler's run off. Let's use this as an opportunity to test attachment. Or here's an opportunity for us to see whether, kind of show how the child really does love their parent, things like that. And then here's the last one, being just ahead of policy and procedure. And I'm absolutely not saying what I'm proposing is a free-for-all where people reject, professional protocols, norms, practice regulations. But when we did analyze the data and we followed practitioners and we talked to them in interviews, we did see a lot of careful, context-specific judgments that were made in families' best interests, informed by the rules and procedures, absolutely, but guided by human need. And my worry is that if we're too much in a command and control environment, what happens is practitioners brush these under the carpets. They're too scared to talk to their managers or supervisors about them. And it could be all sorts of things. It could be, we've seen it with child and family nurses making an appointment go on for longer than strictly the rules allow. Because at 50 minutes and you're supposed to finish off at an hour, this is just when the parents started to feel comfortable and say something valuable. We've seen people referring people back to services or finding alternative pathways so that work that's just started beginning isn't cut off just at the moment of the parent's greatest need. I've seen it when we did a home visit and we managed to find a way into the kitchen, which is very crafty, and found that there was nothing in the cupboards, nothing other than water available in this house. So before the end of the day, of course, we had to go and make sure there was some supermarket vouchers provided and that there was something available for this child. So this is not kind of throwing the rule book out of the window, but it is saying sometimes human need needs us to be just ahead of policy and procedure. And policy and procedure can improve if there's a culture of openness and tolerance for this. And in legal terms, and I put a reference on the last slide, there are moves to call comply and explain, or comply or explain, so that if there's an institutional rule or regulation or a professional body's regulation, the expectation is compliance, but if you don't comply, there's an invitation to explain why not. And it's not assumed that the act of non-compliance is wrong in itself. And I'm suggesting maybe what we have is comply, explain, learn, that normally we expect practice to be contained well within the guidelines or rules or protocols we might have. But sometimes we need to deviate, in which case there's an invitation to explain. And as a result of that explanation, there is learning for the institution, perhaps for the protocols to be updated, or for the person to suggest actually maybe that wasn't the best thing to do in this case. So just to summarize, the impactful partnership is really about thinking about the dilemma of expertise. That's what I focused on in the analyses that I presented today. So the essential ingredients are help, challenge, and possibility in a relationally safe space for learning for both practitioners and families. That if we think about pathways for expertise that avoid that dilemma, we're not bossing parents around, neither are we retreating from our expertise and just being nice, then noticing significance and attributing agency to parents are really important small things with massively big effects. And finally, working at the frontier is all about agility, innovation, difference, and human need. And the last word I'd like to offer there really is that this working at the frontier in all aspects of impactful partnership, but particularly frontier work, is a lot about courage. And we've seen so much courage of families, of children often, and particularly of the practitioners working with them. And it's one of the things that's made me most humble when I've been observing and talking to people like that, is to see not just how knowledgeable these people are, of course they're incredibly knowledgeable, but how courageous in their work are to do difficult work that does have risks, but courageous to be agile, courageous to innovate, and courageous sometimes to be just ahead of policy and procedure. So in the slides which will be made available, there are some follow-up reading there. I'm very, very happy to be contacted by anybody in the follow-up from this webinar. Always very excited to get emails from people who are doing this important work out in the world. And thank you very much. Sorry, I've gone on a few minutes longer than I promised, but we still do have time for questions. I've seen a couple come up, so I'll hand it back over to you, Dale, now.
Thanks, Nick. I'll just try and do that now. Okay, so yeah, we'd love to answer some of your questions. Nick, I know you can see these too. And I've also been joined by the lovely Diana Harris, Erase's
Hi, Diana.
Policy and Programs.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Nick.
Who can go through these questions as well. Thank you very much for that, Nick, first and foremost. I personally really enjoyed that. I loved hearing about how the novelty and strangeness can help fuel innovation. And yeah, I found it a very useful and refreshing, encouraging way of helping people progress and break their routines. So, Nick, you mentioned one of the questions early on from Professor Stratford, who said that while they appreciate the practical ways service providers can make improvements, what are your views on persuading government to move away from short-term approaches?
It's a fabulous question, and it's the one that kind of is a real slow burner for me, and sort of I can give you my thoughts for now, but it's one that I want to keep thinking about, because there is a sense in which if we can't persuade governments of exactly this, you know, to move away from piecemeal, you know, I'll fund the cherry on the cake here and somebody else can do this, we're constantly going to be patching over cracks and more cracks will be appearing. I think there's a number of fronts on which this can happen, some more tangible and concrete than others. One is, I think we have to just keep sharing evidence of kinds that governments don't normally look for. We have to shove it in their face whether they like it or not. Governments like big numbers that tell me this service can deliver this amount of outcomes for this dollar, and I can make it cheaper by this % and get the same outcome. That's really important. But what's also important are narratives, powerful stories of trajectories of change for families, which we can then, if we need to play into an economic argument, suggest that, had this not happened, we've forecast down the track, things would have got more complicated. And of course, complicated for a government person often means more expensive, and expensive is bad. Particularly with the work around the child and family centres, that's where we saw in Tasmania some really interesting agreements of co-funding between governments. And one of the reports I wrote for there was really stressing how, I go back to that sort of soup metaphor, that if we looked at the really powerful transformations for families, and we're talking at times about, a family who threw rocks at a window at the back and passed a baby through a window to get her injection, so fearful was she of other kind of contacts with government. That became a person who was actively involved in play groups and even leading a peer support group called EPEC through the Centre for Parent-Child Support. These kind of trajectories, we have to capture them, and we have to be really honest and say, I'm not going to give you a simple input-output model here, because that's not what the reality is, that's not what the evidence is telling me. And we have to persuade governments, and this is where we're getting less and less tangible, but I think all we can do is make the case and keep making it, whether we're asked to make it or not, to say that you might need to fund things as a government where you can't necessarily ask somebody in 6 months or a year to tell you what you got for your money. You just have to accept that this was one of those ingredients that's gone into that soup, and we can show evidence to suggest that that ingredient is necessary and that without it you're not going to get the outcomes, but we can't promise you complete ownership over those outcomes. The other thing you mentioned is the kind of the short-term thinking, and it plagues us in universities where we don't get grants that last 10 years, which would be lovely. Of course, I'd like more money and longer research, but governments feel precarious, and I understand why. Electoral cycles here in Australia are very short. And not all governments last year in a full electoral cycle, and so there is a sense of obligation to deliver for their electorates on a short-term cycle. But if we're talking about real transformative change, children with trauma backgrounds, families that are very suspicious of services and intervention and things like that, we're not talking about quick fixes. And I don't think there are quick fixes. There are quick wins along the way, small victories we can get. But a quick fix, I think, is most likely to be a dodgy fix and maybe just a sticking plaster. And again, I think it's about getting governments to see that, I think governments do want to make a difference, for all their foibles and they're worried about electorates and things. I think many people in government really do want to make a difference, and that we have to show evidence and make it clear that these are longer trajectories of change with complex things going on. And what governments can be sure in is that they're investing in things which contribute to that change, and we can show the evidence of that. But I think the part we have to do is to kind of show evidence of forms that might not be the forms that government is looking for, and my approach is to be really positive about this and saying, we know these things are essential and these are things you can deliver, and we're seeing the kind of effects that are going on. I'd be really interested if Professor Stratford, you'd like to follow up if you think that's a poor or a weak answer or you have other ideas. But that kind of political engagement with government pieces is really, really important, and one where I can't just look in my data for the answers, so that's where I struggle.
Nick, I would just add to that here at Eracy, we're seeing a growing trend for philanthropic funders to fill that gap, particularly around innovation. As you said, government wants to see the evidence, and as the stewards of taxpayers' money, they have an obligation to go for what appears to be the tried and tested approaches, whereas philanthropic funders have that little bit more flexibility in what they can choose to fund and can fill that gap in terms of trialling approaches with a new cohort or just funding innovation. Our next question is from Kitty, and she is raising flexible learning programs or alternative curriculum programs for young parents who want to go back to school. And the primary purpose of those, of course, is the parent's own education, but they tend to have that secondary purpose and secondary benefit of helping these young parents with their children's education, with their own parenting skills. She's asking if you have any comments around working in those sites.
Not evidence-based comments, I would say. The partnership model that I've sort of it's been prominent in the services I've looked at has been used with schools, and with schools to engage with parents. So I guess I can't talk on a sort of empirical evidence basis, but I think some key principles would really apply. And firstly, what you've got here is, young parents are very much in that group who might be very easy to feel judged. And I think if it was me and I was starting a project on this, my first question would be, I need to understand what matters to young parents. And it may be a whole mix of things which might help us understand them as a group. And maybe this is already well known, but one might speculate that what matters might be being a good parent. It might be still being a teenager, and kind of whatever it is that teenagers or the kind of the young people around them wanting to do, doing the best for their child, but also kind of keeping their life opportunities open and feeling like they're making supported and positive decisions. And it's what I worry a bit about in some of the kind of the services, and it reflects the previous question about short-termism, is that we become too focused on goals. And goals are important things because they can give us a sense of progress, and they can give us a sense of these kind of quick wins. But there are two issues with goals, I think. One is that they're sort of done, goal met, and it invites services, it puts a pressure on services to frame things in a way where they can then get a parent, a young parent included, to say, oh yeah, I've met this goal now. Like I've met the goal of how I manage the logistics of talking to my school and enabling me to come to lessons and also getting my kid into a nursery or something like that. Whereas I think what we're talking about is kind of they're steps on the way. They're not the outcomes themselves. The outcomes are not just resolving goals, and what matters is different. What matters is often longer term, more deeply held. Addressing what matters is about aligning with parents' deeper concerns about the kind of lives they want for themselves and their children. And goals can reflect what matters and come out of what matters, but they're not the same thing. And I think in this kind of group that Kitty's asking about, that would be really important. But also I think that sort of setting, with young parents, in these flexible learning programs, it's that idea of the frontier work. And flexible, and like Diane just said, kind of tried and tested is very safe for somebody funding something. And flexible sounds nice, but too flexible sounds scary. Like, what's going to happen? People are going to go and do anything? And so I think what the evidence we've seen about this impactful partnership and the frontier work is that flexibility isn't about rejecting tried and tested. It isn't about starting from a completely blank page. And what is experienced by families is highly attuned to them, highly customized maybe, highly sensitive to their context, isn't reinventing the wheel. It's often got many, many features that are familiar, well tried and well tested, but they might be presented differently, paced differently, come up in a different sequence. And the point is that these things, however off the shelf certain ideas or strategies or tactics might be, that they're folded into a path in which parents, what matters to parents is our guiding light. What matters to parents and human needs are our guiding light. So I think when you're talking about these kind of, the idea of flexibility, I think it's really helpful to kind of keep in mind, I think, the principle that we got out of this research, which is that a flexible partnership is not infinitely flexible, and it's not, a blank sheet. It's actually taking cues from a lot of established, tried and tested things, but it's how the pathways through which these come up. And very, very flexible services can be offered within relatively stable organizational environments and routine shift patterns. A flexible curriculum doesn't mean that somebody has to kind of invent a new subject or completely abandon the idea of grades and schools and history and all that. Often, I think it comes back to the small things with the big effects. Where flexibility matters most is in those small things and big effects. And other things around it can be quite stable. And I think maybe that might be a helpful way. But again, I'm very interested to hear back from other people.
Our next question is more of a comment from Michelle. and she's addressing the idea of uncomfortable silence and saying that it doesn't have to be uncomfortable, it can be a comfortable silence, and it can be the opportunity for families to speak. She's making the point that in her service it's particularly important when you're working with Indigenous families. Families have to listen to what you say, translate it into language, think about their response, translate that back into English, and all of that takes time. So we have to overcome this discomfort we have with silence.
I couldn't agree more, Michelle, and thank you so much for that comment. And I guess one thing is, yes, I'm certainly culturally very uncomfortable with silence. You probably tell. I whisper on and on and on and on. But this is where that creating opportunities. So one of those frontier slides was about creating opportunities. And I've been very interested in analysing the data going, so how does comfortable silence come up? And what is it that the practitioner does to create the conditions for comfortable silence? And that includes a number of things. Often having a glass of water or a cup of tea really helps. You know, otherwise you're sitting there and you kind of got this sustained eye contact, which can be very confronting, and people can feel forced into saying something quickly. If you can just sit back and sip on some glass and take your eye contact away from somebody's face, or it might be that a child is around and you can kind of divert your attention to a child sitting on the floor or playing or walking. How much more comfortable is silence when you're walking somewhere or doing something together, like doing some washing up or some laundry? I've seen that happen. Let's go fold some clothes if that's what needs doing today. Practitioners have been really innovative in finding ways to produce comfort in silence, because it's in that silence where what you've said as a practitioner might be digested and kind of sit differently rather than rushing on. It certainly gives that impression that you're not bossing and setting the agenda and the pace and worried about your parking meter and you've got to go in 15 minutes, so get on with it. But it also might be that it's in that comfortable silence where a parent says something that they would have been on the edge of saying for 10 minutes, a week, a year, very much so. So I think, yeah, that silence piece is really important, and I think you're absolutely right. There's kind of cultural work we have to do with our comfort levels with silence.
Couldn't agree more, and I'm reminded of a very experienced children's social worker who said to me once, when she has a tricky child, she takes him for a drive, that having a task side by side where you're not sitting facing each other can really open up those conversations.
Yeah,
and he's got a question,
no doubt,
about working with practitioners who are not just working with families, but work in partnership with services that support families, schools, childcare centres, and how best to collaborate with teachers and carers in the same way.
Again, this is something where I know that their work is going in that direction, at least through the family partnership model, and somewhere where I don't have evidence. So I have to be very clear that, you know, this is not a comment that's coming out of data that I've looked at in analysis. But I think if you look in those settings, people are perhaps using somewhat different vocabularies, but they're describing the same phenomenon in a number of ways. As teachers engaging with parents of adolescents, as, you know, school-age children, the same vulnerabilities can come up. The same issue of understanding kind of, you know, what matters to parents, I think, is really important. The more and more we look at kind of how partnership is mandated in all sorts of different settings, I think what we're finding is underneath here is a really welcome and shift in the relational nature of professional practice in a wide range of settings. And I think one reason why I've ended up in this space and why it's been so fertile is that, particularly in child and family and early childhood education settings, these seeds of partnership have landed in the most fertile soil. And in many aspects of nursing and other, social work and other things, these were sort of bubbling away as part of professional sense of themselves for many, many years before things like the family partnership model got invented. And I think in these settings, it's particularly been, productive because people have found often these are a way to articulate values and aspirations that they've had a long time in their practice. The challenge in some of these other settings is, for example, if you think about schools where you've got these, testing regimes that are imposed by government, and I've noticed recently in the UK a plan to test children in their reception class, and children are asking, parents are asking, can they take their children out, and the schools unfortunately have to say no. The more you're in these command and control environments, and education is often one of them, particularly at the school level, where testing regimes are imposed and assessment regimes and things like that. The more delicate that can become. But I think not only more delicate, but the more important and the more needed this kind of approach to partnership is.
Thank you, Nick. We do have more questions, as you can probably see at your end as well, and
Yeah.
look really valuable. But we've unfortunately run out of time today. So with your blessing, I'll forward those on to you. And thank you for those of you that have asked questions. I would love to see those answered as well. And thank you for participating today. And thank you, Nick, for your presentation.
My pleasure. It's been an absolute thrill. Really, really cool. Yeah, delighted.
It's been fantastic, thank you. And you've provided a really articulate framework that will help people on the ground. I'd like to let everyone know that we've recorded today's webinar, so we'll make that recording available on the Eracy website for our members in the next few days, and we'll be announcing that in our newsletter. If you'd like to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter, you can do so at eracy.org.au/register, and if you're an Eracy member, we also send out a daily newsletter as well. If you've paid for today's webinar, please consider an Eracy membership. The webinar is free for Eracy members, and we have a rich ongoing program. Thank you once again, Nick. It's been a fantastic presentation.
And anybody who's had an unanswered question, please just email me as well, and I'll be really happy to follow up by phone or email or whatever. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, we'll include your details on the page with the recording in that case, Nick.
Very welcome. Yeah.